Okay. Yeah, so good evening again for a second time and welcome to the Tech of Scotland's August online forum with the fantastic Jen MacDougall from the University of Glasgow. Just a couple of housekeeping points. Please keep your microphones off for the time being unless you want to ask a question, just because it helps with everybody's sound quality, and pop your hand up if you do want to ask a question. We're recording this evening's session and it will be available on our YouTube channel after the event, and I'll share that link in our chat. So without further ado, let's hand over to Jen. Jen is speaking on a fantastic subject this evening, as she's quite nicely shown in her opening slide, assessing language. Can we ever get it right? Jen, over to you and a big thanks.
Okay, hello. Hello, can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, yeah, my name's Jen MacDougall, or Jennifer MacDougall, whichever you want to call me. And I work at Glasgow University. And I chose this topic because I guess it's so important to all of us at the moment, or at any time. And also in my job, the job I'm doing at the moment, it's become more and more important. So first of all, maybe I should just give you a little bit of context for what I do at Glasgow University. I work for the engineering department, the School of Engineering, on a joint educational project program in China, in Chengdu in China. And I manage the English language side of that. And so part of the management of the English language side of this engineering program is, of course, creating assessments and marking and moderating and all sorts of aspects related to assessment. So for me, I guess this is a big part of my job now. And when I started to think about assessment, and I've called them my assessment credentials, but I'm sure you've all got assessment credentials. So I just threw out some of the things that I have assessed in terms of language or related to language teaching over the years. And I was thinking about how much we assess and how much we're involved in assessment. So, you know, it goes from working for external organisations such as Cambridge and Trinity, to teacher training gigs where I've been involved in assessing. I've never been an IELTS examiner, but I've had to create IELTS type tests and administer those as part of the course the program that I run at the moment. And I'm also an internal moderator for things that are assessed, the tests that are created. And I'm an external examiner for another program, which is also set up in China with a different university. So I guess my first question to you guys that maybe you can throw in the chat is, what sort of things are you involved in assessing at the moment? Perhaps you could just put comments in the chat. So what are your assessment credentials, perhaps?
Can you see the chat, Jen?
Yeah, I can. Yeah,
great.
Thanks.
Just checking.
So we can see a lot of people involved in SQA assessment, which I was when I worked in ESOL, but I don't work in ESOL anymore. But then also other types of assessments, such as the Cambridge exams. Again, teacher training, CELTA, the Teaching ESOL Literacies course. Somebody's an IELTS examiner. Skills for Life, City and Guilds, okay, yeah. internal EAP assessments, TOEFL. So we can see a wide variety of things that we're assessing. And I guess we're also assessing things just on a, a daily basis as teachers. I didn't put in the fact that we're constantly assessing, but that's something that we do. So we're all involved in assessment, no matter what we do, I think, if we're involved in ESOL or in EAP, as I'm involved in. So I've got a little Mentimeter question for you. Let me just stop sharing and share my Mentimeter. Hopefully you see the right one. Can you see that, Pauline? Yes? Okay, so all I'd like you to do, you can, if you've got your phone beside you, you go to www.menti.com and there's a code, or you can use the QR code with your phone, which is much easier and it should take you directly there. And I'd like you just to write down any feelings you have about the language assessments you're involved in. How does language assessment make you feel? Words or phrases? Not getting anything through at the moment. Let's see if it, maybe I'll try. Oh, we've got one. Two. Get rid of the image and we should start seeing. Oh, there you go. Frustrated, focused, tense. Can be very useful. I wonder why the person who's written frustrated at times feels frustrated. Perhaps we'll hear that about that later on. Perhaps we can come back to this. We've only got 2 people who've commented on it, but we can, no, we're not getting anything else through. We're just getting different shapes. Okay. Lots of different shapes. Okay, let's leave it at the moment. You can add your own ideas as we're talking, if you've opened up the Mentimeter, okay? But I'll go back to my slides. Okay. So go back to my slides. Always fun and games trying to maneuver between things. Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about assessment, and of course I work in higher education. I work at Glasgow University now, so a lot of my focus is on EAP, but I think, or English for academic purposes, but I think as we talk about this, the language assessment in general fits together. I think all that I've learned from ESOL, I would say. Okay, and I'm just giving you perhaps a recommendation of a book which I've found very useful, very user-friendly on assessment and assessing EAP. It does say on EAP, but I think you'll find it useful in your own context too, if you want to learn more about assessment. So according to Manning, these are some of the terms that he uses for assessment. So assessment is about how we gather language data for the purpose of evaluation. And he kind of uses this umbrella term for assessment rather than separating out tests and assessment. He keeps the whole thing together. So it's this idea of evaluation and measuring language ability. And he also, in the book that I've just mentioned, he talks about assessment literacy and about this being what we as practitioners need to understand or know about assessment. I think when we talk about assessment literacy now, it's also quite important for what our students need to understand and know about assessment, because that idea of transparency of assessment is really important. So I don't think assessment literacy is only for the practitioner, but these are the general terms that are used. Okay, so we can start off just by looking at some of the ideas behind assessment and why we do what we do. Why do we assess people for language? And here are some of the reasons, I guess, that the purposes of assessment. We often assess people to get feedback and also to provide feedback. That can often be in a kind of formative setting where it doesn't relate to a final certification or a final grade, but it's really to give that kind of feedback of where are you now and where do you need to get to. Assessment often has the purpose of measuring things, measuring ability, or measuring success in achieving certain objectives. But another purpose of assessment is about gatekeeping. And for any of us in English language teaching in any sphere, we know about this, whether it's a gate to allow people to enter into a certain area or field, or a gate to stop people entering a certain area or field because they haven't achieved what's required. So that might be just about being ready to move levels and to get to different stages in your proficiency level, let's say. But it can also be about whether you're allowed to enter a mainstream course in a college, or whether you're allowed to apply for specific jobs, etc. And as I say here, you've got providing grades, qualifications, certification, license to do something can be impacted on that assessment of language. And I put more here because I'm sure that people have other thoughts on why we assess. I mean, if you have any other thoughts, you can throw them into the chat. I now can't see the chat for some reason. I wonder why not.
Nothing in the chat so far.
Nothing in the chat. Okay, so you can be thinking about these things as we go along, and we'll come back to, oh yeah, I can see the chat up here. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Okay, I can see it. Okay, so different types of assessments. Oh, this is still about what people assess rather than why they assess. Okay, and then of course we have lots of different types of assessment types, and you know, we have this kind of maybe double-sided thing of whether an assessment is objective, i.e. there is a specific answer, or whether it's subjective and it relies on us as assessors to have some kind of professional judgment. And I think we see in language testing a lot more movement towards subjective testing, which obviously, once you bring in the human being into an assessment, that creates all sorts of issues around, well, objectivity and standardization, but also bias in the way that people see things. So this is one of my questions about, can we ever get it right? So with objective testing, you know, it probably sits more when we are doing things like listening and reading tests, where you can give a specific answer and it can be right or wrong. But of course, even with listening and reading tests, they are starting to change as well in the way that people are assessing listening and reading, and questioning whether you can really have objective testing that would be valid. We have direct versus indirect testing as well. So again, I guess there's more of a movement towards direct testing, where we're trying to assess the performance of a student doing something in the language, so you're assessing the doing or the performance of that. And so this brings in aspects of authenticity and the difficulty in making assessments authentic, which we'll come back to. But when we go to objective testing, we have these kind of discrete point tests where you get a point for getting the right answer. My feeling is this is not something which is that common anymore in language testing. Of course, in huge tests like IELTS, there still has to be some of this kind of discrete point testing. What we find that we're seeing a lot more of certainly in EAP, and I think with some of the major exam boards, is integrative tests, where more than one skill is being assessed at the same time. So the performance is assessed through the output of writing or speaking, but it's linked to what the person is doing internally through the reading, the listening assessments. And in fact, at times you can have an integrative test which combines more than 2 skills together, but you can only really assess the output skill. Another aspect of assessment that's quite important is this whole aspect of the criteria or the criterion referenced assessment. So most of us now will be used to working with sets of criteria where we have to use that professional judgment related to a criteria which shows different levels or different levels of achievement. And again, that can be quite complex for us to work through. Norm reference testing, I don't think happens so often now, but it would be where we're comparing different performances of different students so that you would get the best to the weakest. We actually do this in our in my context with our new students coming in first year. We do a kind of diagnostic assessment where the students who get the lowest marks in their listening part of this assessment, we offer them additional support. But this is not actually criterion referenced, it's norm referenced, because it depends on how many students we have and where we put a cutoff point. So this would be norm referencing, I suppose. And there are also tests that use speed and how much someone can get through to show how good or proficient this student is. There used to be an old placement test that did this a lot. I wouldn't name it, but some of you may have used it, where if the student got to a certain point, it showed that they were at least a certain level. And so this was using speed and power, I guess, to assess. Okay. So a little story here. One of my first kind of points at which I really started to think about assessment was when and how it works, I guess, was when I became not a Cambridge examiner, but when I became a Trinity examiner, and I had a fantastic team leader who always talked to us about, we were speaking examiners, and when we were doing standardization, it was always very difficult to get people to agree on what the grade was. And one of her comments about this was always that assessing language was an art, not a science. Which throws up a lot of problems, doesn't it? If you can't say that you can measure something specifically and accurately, and it can be the same for everybody. And so one of the questions I always ask the teachers that I work with in China is, how confident are you in the assessment decisions that you make? And it's interesting what you hear people say, because I think there's a balance. I don't think it's really that helpful to be too confident in your assessment decisions. At the same time, you need to have a certain level of confidence in your assessment decisions. But I do get the feeling that some people who think they're always right in their assessment decisions aren't taking account of all the things that affect how they make that decision. And so I've used the 3 bears here as a little bit of an analogy of, you know, is it too much, too little, or can we just get it right about how confident we are? And some of you might have some thoughts on this later as well. So when we think about assessment, I suppose there's certain cornerstones that we can focus on. There's these set kind of areas, concepts of validity, reliability, practicality, or practicability, some people talk about. There's issues around cross-cultural fairness when we're assessing. Can everybody be assessed in the same way? IELTS has a lot of work that they do when they're writing their assessments to make sure that this can be globally written for everybody. But actually, does that mean that the assessment doesn't work for some people? Backwash effect, of course, how does the assessment itself affect what's happening in the classroom? Is that positive or is it negative? Does the assessment mean that what happens is people just teach to a test, and actually, because this test isn't very valid, which we'll come back to in a moment, it means that the effect in the classroom is very weak or very poor? And with very valid tests, does it help to develop good backwash effect? And then there's the aspect of assessment of learning versus assessment for learning. To what extent does the way that we assess actually help people to learn, not just about assessment, but to develop the skills they need to develop, rather than just being tested or being evaluated? So all of these things combine together to make assessment very complex, I would say. So when we think about validity, what are we thinking about with validity? Well, the main point about validity, I can't even read my own slides with all these things around. I think I need to turn off my chat. Okay, so the main thing about validity, I guess, is that this idea of construct validity is whether or not we are evaluating what we set out to evaluate. And I put a quote up here of what the idea behind construct validity is. So it's kind of overarching validity. Is the assessment valid? Does it actually do what it sets out to do? So if we are assessing note-taking skills, sorry, there will be so many parameters of what would need to be assessed within that note-taking, I can't even say that, note-taking skills, that how can those be assessed in a valid way? How can it actually be done? And this is what I guess we are working towards all the time. And there's different types of validities, apparently. There's face validity, which I've always wondered about. So face validity is, you know, it looks like a horse, it drinks like a horse, so it is a horse kind of thing. So it's how the assessment looks to the stakeholders. Does it look as though it assesses what it's supposed to assess? So does it have credibility, I guess, is what face validity is about. And then content validity, does the material that's being used have validity? And criterion, is it meeting the criteria of what you would be doing within the construct that you want to assess? The problem that we've seen with assessment in the past, and I think that we've been grappling with and we've been trying to improve a lot over the years, and we've improved hugely, is that there was often situations where what was being assessed or what was purportedly being assessed was not being assessed. It was something completely different. So when we looked at a reading assessment that assesses as part of it whether or not somebody spells something correctly, it's not really assessing reading, is it? And you can see that through the SQA assessments, that where they've made allowances for this to try to be more valid in what they're assessing. You see it throughout all the guidance. I don't work with SQA, but I have read some of it recently, and it has changed over the years. So another aspect of this, another cornerstone, is the whole aspect of reliability. And again, it's like, well, is it ever really possible to be completely reliable? Can an assessment be completely reliable? I mean, we're talking about human beings. So the idea that in every situation, which is what we're trying to achieve, that in every situation, a test will behave, or an assessment will behave in the same way, no matter who takes it and no matter who assesses it. That seems to be a very, very difficult thing to achieve. And you tend to get this imbalance or problem of the more you make something valid, the less reliable it becomes. Because the more you make something valid, the more is about the human being performing something, and the more it's about the assessor using professional judgment. So there's a greater human element involved in it, then reliability would fall. Yeah. So how do you improve reliability? What do you do to try and make it as reliable as possible? Well, I mean, I had this discussion with the teachers I work with in China about the process that we go through when we're creating an assessment, and the number of stages that you have to go through in order to try and make something work as well, not just for reliability, but also for validity. But, you know, we start with designing, then we're pre-testing, then we have an internal moderation system for the assessment. And this goes on until you get to the point where you're preparing the students, so they need to know exactly what they're being assessed on to make something more reliable. Then you need standardization in terms of the marking, and this goes on and on and on. So there needs to be many, many processes to build reliability into any kind of assessment. And you see that again in the SQA assessments, where you have, I'm sure you have group marking, you have internal moderation, you have external moderation, and the amount of time it perhaps takes to get the assessment in the first place. So this is all building in reliability. So I'm not going to talk about backwash, etc., specifically or generally, let me focus in on one assessment that I've been working on, and then talk about some of these points, just try and remind myself, such as practicality and backwash effect when I'm talking about this. Okay, so here's context. So when I came to Glasgow University to work on this with the engineers on this joint educational program in China, our students were assessed as a gatekeeping assessment through IELTS. So unlike students who are entering university in the UK, where they would have to get a certain IELTS score when they joined the university, our students had 2 years to develop their English, and then they were assessed at the end of 2 years. So we call it a kind of progression. So it's before they go into the senior part of their degree. Now, bearing in mind, our students all stay in China for their degree. They're not doing this coming from China to study in Glasgow. They're studying in the university in China, which is UESTC. It's an electronic science technology university. So we had a lot of problems with this. So the progression route for the students was IELTS. They were engineering students. They spent 2 years doing IELTS classes ad infinitum. We had a lot of problems in terms of a lack of stakeholder confidence in the assessment process that existed, because the students would do IELTS-like tests internally and pass them, but then they also had to take an external IELTS test, and a lot of them would not meet the criteria and the scores that they were required to get. So we wanted to create a progression route that was more aligned with the students' needs. So we were looking at English for specific academic purposes, something that would fit with what the students are actually doing as engineers. And we found a course that already existed. So we build up to this course. This is their final course. So we found a course that already existed, which was called Engineering Career Skills, which most engineering students take a course like this across the world, as far as I know, certainly in the UK. And we developed this course and changed it, adapted it, and made it a course called English Communication and Engineering Career Skills. So we made the course bigger and we made it more linked to communication. So this idea was that we would, that shouldn't say embed the new assessment and the assessment within a learning process. It should say embed the new course and the assessment within a learning process. So the idea here was that the learning process, something that was relevant to the students, we would develop this course and the assessments would come organically from this assessment, from this course. That was the idea that we had. Now, our students have already had, at this point, 1.5 years of English, and we've been working on engineering-related courses. We've changed all of our courses at this point, but this is the final one. I can't talk about all of them, so just the final one. So the focus was to work on developing their speaking and writing skills. And the idea was that because this was going to be the gatekeeping progress course, we wanted to link it to things that the students would have to do later on in their degree. And one of the things that the students have to do in an engineering degree is they do, much like in the arts and humanities, we would do a dissertation, they do a final year project. So it's more practical, and they have to write up their research and they have to talk about the research. Another aspect of what we wanted to do was we wanted to make them become better at explaining the things they were doing to a more of a lay audience, because the students, we had found, what they tended to do was copy a lot of technical stuff, and it was really difficult for anyone who wasn't an engineer to understand. So this was twofold. We were going to be delivering, our group of English teachers in China were going to be delivering this course. So if it was very, very technical, we wouldn't understand any of it. But this would be part of the assessment, was their ability to communicate at a lay level. And here are the outcomes that we have for the course. I won't read them all out to you, but you'll be able to see that, you know, it's about the writing technical documents, presentations. We've got aspects to do with working in a team. And then we have an employability section as well. So these were the learning outcomes. And actually some of these learning outcomes already existed in the old course, but we zhushed them up to give them more of an English language component. And our assessments for this course, we base them all around a simulation of an internship. So at the beginning of the course, the students are put into a situation where they are learning about what they would do if they were applying for an internship. So we've created this, we think, quite authentic construct. And within that, they also have to do writing and oral assessments. We wanted to keep this very much English for specific academic purposes, not just general academic purposes. So it's very much focused into the engineering field. And these are the phases of the assessments and the course itself. So the course follows these 3 phases, and the students follow these phases and do the assessments at the end of each phase. They also have a final written exam, but we've made most of the assessment, the largest chunk of the assessment in terms of how it's measured is focused on the coursework. So 60% of the assessment is coursework. So we start with an employability section, where the students have to create a portfolio based on an internship ad, and then they also have to take part in a group interview. I'll show you that in a moment. They then, as part of their internship, are asked to write a report, a research report based on, they're given different topics that are related to grand challenges in engineering. And we give them some texts that they are provided with to start off their research, and then they go off and they research the topic, and they write a piece of academic writing of about 1,000 words, which is the biggest piece of work they've ever written at this stage, including referencing, etc. And then towards the end of the course, they get to present in a group on a grand challenge in engineering. And we wanted to move away from presentations being just about the content, and we wanted to work with them very much on how they engage an audience and how they communicate with a lay audience, because apparently this is a big challenge, a grand challenge for engineering students. They tend to go overly technical in presentations. So let me show you some of the work that they do. I've taken out anything that would be a live assessment, so in case anybody comes across it and says, oh, that's what I'll be getting tested on next year. I'm sure that won't happen. So in the portfolio, which is their first assessment, they are given, you see on the left-hand side here, I've got a little extract of a job ad for an internship. This is just the beginning of it. So they're given a job ad, and then you have to use that job ad to submit the following items of a portfolio. So this allows us to assess their writing, and it also allows us to link it into a speaking assessment where they do a group interview, which is one of their favorite parts for some reason. They love the group interview. One thing that we're doing for next year is we're taking out the written personal profile and just making it part of the CV. Because what we found was that with the video personal profile, which we were kind of trying to champion as something to build the students' communication and engagement skills, they were tending just to recite the written personal profile. So it wasn't really working. So we're going to change it slightly next year. Okay, so then after they've written their profiles and done all that work, they then go into a group interview situation, and they take part as both interviewer and as interviewee. So they take on both roles, and they get preparation in the classroom for both of those roles in terms of the types of questions they would ask, how to answer questions. We do things on STAR technique. We do all sorts of aspects of how to work in an interview context. So this is just part of the task that they're being given if they're in the interviewer role. And I'm sure you can imagine some of the complexities of trying to do something like this with a group of students. We'll come to that in a moment. So the students have then, they basically on their internship when they come to the next assessment, and in the next assessment, they have a written assignment. So as part of their training, they've been asked by their supervisor to look at an area of research and evaluate different approaches to that area. Now, this is the part which I've taken out. I'm not telling you which areas of research, the areas of focus, because they're still live assessments. But what we do is we work with the engineers on this to identify areas which will work for different engineering students. All our students are electrical engineers, but some of them do microelectronics and some of them do communication engineering. So we try to make sure that we've got 3 different areas of focus, and each area of focus is more or less suitable for a different type of student who's on a slightly different program. We do find that it doesn't really make any difference, and there seems to be a favorite topic that they go for, which is usually the one that's the least complicated. Fair enough. So they research it. They're given a couple of texts by us. They're given 2 journal articles for each of the areas of focus to get them started, but they then have to go off and do their own research, which we've already trained them, or we've developed their skills in that, about how to use the library, how to use specific referencing skills. You'll maybe see here in our overarching assessment criteria that we have citation and reference skills following IEEE style, which is an engineering style. I've thrown in the assessment criteria for this, but this is just our overarching, and then at each level we give a bit more guidance on what they need to get to achieve an excellent, very good, etc. in each area. And the criteria is open to both the students and the teachers, of course, to the assessors as well. So that's the written assignment. And then the final part of the coursework assignment is the presentation. So this is kind of supposed to be, it's the end of their internship, and they're going to like a, you know, a nice event where they have to present. And here we give them the choice of different grand challenges, very open, and they work as a group to deliver a presentation about these grand challenges, and give them, there's more focused questions and tasks that they have to do. But again, I've left that out. As I said, a big part of our assessment here is to get the students to think about how to engage an audience, and how to engage an audience of non-specialists, because it's something that engineers have to do a lot. They have to work with people who are non-specialists. So again, this kind of idea of what's realistic. So those are the assessments. But creating something which we think is quite authentic, and we think meets the needs of the students, also creates difficulties. The assessments are challenging for the students. The assessments are challenging for the teachers in different ways. Our marking criteria can take time to get used to. And it requires a lot of professional judgment, and requires a lot of understanding what is the construct validity. What is it that we're really looking for? And I've put this term ambiguity and tolerance in here because one of the things that we found as we've been working with our assessors, our teachers, and with the students, is that actually they find it quite difficult to deal with this idea of flexibility in how we judge things. They want, and I guess many of us want, when we're being assessed, to know exactly if something is right or wrong. And so when you have this idea of somebody wanting something to be right or wrong, this can cause problems in terms of backwash, because you get the situation where you have to make things less flexible than you really want to, so that people feel confident that they're all being assessed in the same way, and that they can somehow get 100%, which is virtually impossible in a language exam, as you know, especially a performance-based assessment and task-based assessment as these are. So creating the tasks, we find that we have to constantly revisit and think about what changes we need to make things work better. And a lot of it is also about the assessors and the teachers, who are the assessors, becoming more familiar with the ideas and the constructs that we're working on. I mentioned practicalities before, and I've mentioned a few of these in the last few minutes, but in terms of us standardizing our marking and moderating our marking, this is very complex, because within the course we have around about 10 to 12 teachers assessing the students. So trying to get everybody to think the same way and to assess to a standard is complex. And if you're bringing new teachers in each year who, you know, some of whom have not done the course the year before, then again, you have this imbalance and you're constantly having to train people up. The authenticity creates difficulties. For example, our group interviews, we have potentially eight students in a room at the same time, between 6 and 8 students, 3 on each side, 3 as assessors, 3 as 3 as interviewers, 3 as interviewees. And of course, what you really want to do is to have 2 assessors in the room at the same time, but this can be problematic because of timetabling and numbers, and trying to get something like this takes a lot of work to do to assess. So the authenticity itself creates problems. And we did have teachers saying, well, can we not just have a normal interview where the teacher would assess the student for 5 minutes? So trying to change assessment can be difficult. And I guess that leads to the whole idea about backwash, because there are some parts of it that we feel very, very happy and confident that we're getting it right. But there are other places where it feels like there's still this need to be able to keep everything very, very tight and clear, which means that people like to script things. And once we start to get into scripting of spoken assessment, it completely takes away from what we're trying to do. But at the same time, we need to prepare the students for the assessment that they're doing, for example, the group interview. So we have to provide some of the questions that they're going to use, not all of the questions. So of course there's opportunities for scripting, etc. So that's problematic. Another problem is group work, because there are great benefits in the group work, but also we have difficulties where if a student is weak or a student isn't engaging, then other students might be doing the work for them, for example, in the presentation. But it's part of what they have to do in their engineering courses. They have to work in groups and they're assessed in groups. So we're trying to be authentic again. And then there's the aspect of pressure that's coming from the students and the stakeholders. Because this is a progression course and the students need to get very specific, they have to pass each of the elements that they do in order to meet our criteria. There can be pressure both from the university in China and from the students themselves for us, or for the teachers, to pass students on things that aren't actually, don't meet the criteria. And I've already mentioned pressure at time. Okay, don't think we're going to have time for much. Okay, another problem we have is in the written assignments, because students have to be given a lot of time to do this, we have problems with plagiarism. And this is becoming something which is across all courses in universities, not just in our course, but again, it's very time consuming to deal with. And we also find we're getting plagiarism in the spoken assignments, particularly in the presentations, where students will take a text and read it out as a presentation. However, we've had success in terms of how the students feel about the course. Our progression numbers have increased hugely, and we used to have remedial courses for the students who had failed the IELTS test. That has disappeared in the last 2 years. And here's some of the comments that the students have made. I'm just aware of the time now. I didn't think this would take so long. Okay. And okay, my last comment though about assessment is the whole idea of how ethical assessments are. And I've put a few comments here for us to think about. You know, is it possible for us to have something that's neutral when we're assessing students? I'm not sure if it is. We're human beings. We have political elements that are all around us in terms of who assesses, why people are being assessed, how they're being assessed. There are huge power imbalances. The effect on somebody not achieving can be huge. I mean, we know about this in ESOL very much. I tried to throw a few ideas of things that I had come across where, you know, you have to think about, well, how do you feel when you're assessing a person for this? You know, somebody needs a spouse visa. I had a man who told me in an exam about how his wife had died and he was now looking after 3 children. How do you deal with these things? In Spain, teachers who were a PE teacher who needs certification for English to teach PE in Spain, even though they will be teaching in Spanish. Interesting dilemmas here. A trainee teacher in a certificate course, for example, they're being assessed, maybe they're having a bad day. What about the shy, the quiet student who's doing a speaking assessment, a presentation, but their skills, is that just about language or is that about personality? What are we doing there? Speaking exams where you have a complete power imbalance, and in high level speaking exams, students are supposed to disagree with the assessor. How do they do that when they know that person's in charge? That hegemony going on here that we need to think about. What about students who've only developed literacy skills? How do they cope with all the assessment literacy that exists? Whether it's spoken or written or whatever, it's still literacy that they have to deal with. And ourselves and our own bias, you know, how do we actually deal with that? How do we work out what it is that makes us assess people in a certain way? And this comment came from one of our students in the course in ECECS this year. And this was a mention about the fact that they must achieve every single course element and the pressure that it put on the students as they were doing the assessments, the veto power of each assessment, they called it. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes left. So I guess perhaps we can just take any comments or any thoughts on what I've shown you today. We definitely don't have time for the task, so we'll just leave it there. But would anybody like to ask a question or join in?
Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
And ask Jen anything you want or comment on something that she's spoken about. I've just noticed I'm looking like I'm sitting in a darkened room, but it looks darker on the screen than it does in person.
Very dark.
Yeah, it looks quite sinister now that you're not sharing. Yeah. I don't think there are any questions, Jen.
No questions whatsoever. Okay. Well, all I can say is thank you very much for coming along this evening. And if you do have any questions, you can always get in touch with me.
Absolutely. So thank you. Look at that. We're finishing bang on 8 o'clock. That was deliberate timing, I think, Jen. Thank you very much. Absolutely. So a huge thanks for your time and for a very interesting presentation. Your part at the end for me, which was about the ethics and the sort of scenarios in an ESOL classroom. I think for somebody who teaches a literacy stream, then there is quite a lot to think about when it comes to assessment and making it authentic and as a situation where that student can achieve as well. But you're right, there's lots of power at play. So very interesting concept. So thank you, Jen. It's great to have you with us tonight. And thank you everybody else for joining us. We already have our next session that we're just about to advertise. So look at our website soon for our following online forum. But until then, take care, everybody, and I hope the return to work or college, if that's you this week, isn't too scary. And we'll see you all again soon. Thanks again, Jen.
Everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.